Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. I'm your host as always, Marcus Sadu, and we are at episode number 92 already. 100 is fast approaching. Wow. Today we've got Danny Lennon back on the show. Danny is one of my favorite people in the fitness industry. Super smart dude, solid guy. This is actually his second time on the podcast. He was on episode 11 talking about the ketogenic diet. So if you're interested in checking that out, you can go back to episode 11. Now, today we are going to be talking about podcasting and how to ask great questions and just essentially conversating with people. I think that this is going to be a useful episode no matter if you are interested in podcasts or not, because it's essentially just having conversations with people. So Danny and I compare notes a little bit in this episode as far as podcasting goes. I asked him a whole bunch of questions about how he got into podcasting to begin with. So he started way back in 2014. So he was one of the early adopters. We also get into how he sources guests to interview, how he preps for those podcasts. And I was really interested in getting his opinion on whether there's a recipe for asking a good question that yields a better or a worse response. So we talk about that. We also get into who we think are some of the best podcasters right now. And then we wrap up with potentially how to grow an audience or how we think about growing an audience and approaching that concept. So this was a really cool episode. I really enjoyed this chat with Danny, and I hope you do too. Let's get into it. So I've recommended Sigma to a ton of folks because it's just really well done. I think you're a solid dude. Now, what made you decide to go down the podcast route specifically as opposed to something like YouTube videos, writing articles, or whatever other medium? Why podcasts?
So when I started, mine was like early 2014. And for the couple of years before that, I was maybe in the minority of people at that time that was regularly listening to podcasts and just used to enjoy doing that. And really there was no master plan. For me, it was when I started building my brand, I was like, okay, there's these various different media that I can put out information. And my first thought was the overzealous beginner mindset of, I'll just do it all, right? I'll start this podcast. I'll have a YouTube channel. I'm going to write articles every week. And I started doing that. And not only do you see it's probably not doable, it's certainly not doable well, I don't think. But then it was also that initially the podcast was an intersection of something that I was enjoying doing, felt I could do well at, and also started to get a bit of traction early on. And so I made the decision of, okay, I'm just not going to do any of this YouTube stuff. I'm going to maybe write articles now and again, but not going to be a major focus. And most of my attention is going to go on this podcasting thing and trying to build that up. And that was as simple as it was. And in hindsight, I think it's actually something I typically recommend people from a business perspective now of, you can try various different things, but when you find something's not a good match or a good fit, be willing to quit on that early. And that's not to say quit on something because it's difficult, quit on something when you know it's not a good fit for you or your time could be spent better elsewhere and it's not a failure, right? So instead of me saying, I need to keep trying to doing all these things would be a mistake. And similarly, advising people to pick out which one of these formats is best suited to you. There's no point in you trying to do a podcast because you see me doing one when you could be a phenomenal writer and could do amazing articles every week that would do way better. Or you could be a massive YouTuber if you put all your attention into that. And so, yeah, for me, it was simply a case of trying those and quickly realizing that I like this. I seem to have some skills that might be well suited to it. And people seem to be responding well to it initially. And so just doubling down on it for that reason.
I think that's such an important point around knowing when to call it quits, the sunk cost fallacy, because if it just constantly reassessing from where you are at right now as opposed to what you've invested to that point is key.
Absolutely. And I think Seth Godin talks about this quite a lot within relation to people's careers, that pushing back on this idea that winners never quit. And in fact, you actually see it's the opposite. The people who do best across a lot of domains try many different things, and as soon as they find something's not a good fit for them, they give up on that immediately, don't feel any guilt about doing so, and then move on to another project or another role or another direction, and from there, that's the way you have success. And then when you find something that's worth doing, then you persevere and try hard even when it's difficult, but as long as it's got that good fit for you.
Absolutely. Now, how do you go about finding your guests? Are folks reaching out to you? Are you reaching out to them? A bit of both? And then also, is there a vetting process? And if so, how does that work?
So my rule of thumb has generally been that I will go and select the guests that I want on. So as I'm sure you've probably got, there's various different PR firms that will like pitch you one of their people that has like some book. And a lot of the time it's so irrelevant that I can tell they don't know what my podcast is about because they're sending me someone who just is not a good fit at all. So I have up on my website where you can get my email, there's like a little my policies, and you click into it and it says, do not pitch me someone for the podcast. Like, I just don't listen to those emails. And so mine has been, I'll go out and seek out people I think will be a good fit, either that I know, or that I know their work. So for a lot of the people that end up being on my podcast, what has worked out well is many of them, so there's some that have obviously been on lots of podcasts that are well known. There's been quite a lot who are just academics and researchers who either don't have a social media presence or who don't really appear in many interviews, that I just came across their research papers. And because I was reading them and familiar, I was like, oh, I could have some questions here. Maybe I'll reach out and get them on a podcast. And that's usually been the way it's doing it. And that's why I think there's the topics that come up on the podcast randomly from week to week, is because that's where my interest tends to fleet around. And when I find something interesting and a certain area of research, I'll do that. Or if someone that I respect and know well says, hey, I've got a really, really good person I know well that is doing some really cool work, you should look into it. And they might look into it, and from there, that's the way it works for me. So that's typically been my strategy. I see no value in getting someone on the podcast who I don't know who they are or who their work is, and someone's given me a blurb and it's like, just start talking to this person. Just doesn't make sense to me. I wouldn't be able to do it. So that's the way I've gone about it. It's usually someone who I've read their work, followed their work, saw them at a lecture, read their research papers, something like that. And then I'll contact them off the back end of that.
Gotcha. And I get all sorts of people reaching out from those PR firms as well. I'm curious, do you respond to all those emails or do you just delete them?
No, the majority of the time is just an immediate delete, and that's what I have it in my policies. Like, there will not be an answer. Sometimes then when I'm in a bit of a salty mood now and again, if I'm a bit tired and stuff, I'll take exception to one and just say, like, you obviously haven't looked into this at all. This is just a copy and pasted email. Or sometimes it'll be someone who is like genuinely putting out just like really harmful information around ideas. And a couple of times I've like emailed them back and saying, like, hey, I know you just work with this marketing company and it's nothing to do with you, and this person isn't your company, but just to let you know, the stuff they're saying is nonsense, right? I got one about these two people that wanted to come on and talk about helping people's brain chemistry and alleviating people's depression. And you look into them and they're two chiropractors. And I was like, oh, come on, this is like really shady. Like, so I just like said to the company, look, not only do I not want this, like, this is just not good stuff. But I've got all sorts of crazy ones. The ones that have like nothing to do with nutrition and health. They're the ones that really crack me up. It's like, why are you reaching out to me? Like, this is nothing to do with me. Like, so it's funny, but usually it's ignore.
Fair enough. Now, something I've noticed for myself is that the more preparation I put into an episode, the better it goes. Shocker. How much prep time are you putting in per episode on average? And then what does that prep process look like for you? I'm the exact same. The more preparation I do, it goes smoother. And the ironic thing is also, and maybe when you think about it, it's not actually ironic, but maybe counterintuitive to people, is that the more and more I prep and write things out and make notes, the less notes I need during an interview, almost none.
the more well-researched I am, I go in and just have a conversation and don't need to reference anything. And to me, that's a sign of success, that I've absorbed enough and I've really tried to think through some of this stuff that I just have natural questions that emerge, and I maybe have a few bullet points to keep me on track. So the research process and the time is usually dictated by what the topic is. So for example, it could be a topic that I'm relatively well versed in, or I've came across quite recently and I'm very familiar with, and with someone who I have talked with quite a lot offline. So for example, at Sigma Nutrition, our research communication officer, Alan Flanagan, is a good friend of mine. We talk a lot outside of the podcast world and in real life, and we talk a lot about his research that he's conducting in chrononutrition. We talk about that field generally because we both read papers in that. And so if me and him do a podcast on that topic, it doesn't take as much because all the research is kind of done, if that makes sense. However, then for other topics, it would depend. So I could be talking to someone more about the soft skills around coaching and generally working as a practitioner. So again, that's more of a conversation that's really interesting, that takes some prep, but not as much if I was talking to a researcher that specializes in mitochondria and oxidative stress in very specific rodent models, and I have to refer to their research. So it looks a bit different. In terms of the process, usually it starts with just an overall extensive reading, highlighting then of certain papers or articles or interviews that were particularly useful to me, or a certain point in those that was a really good point. And then I'll come back and then refine those and pull and draft each of those points into a certain document. And then from there, as I start reading through that, I start trying to just think as many possible avenues that they could go. So stuff that wasn't in an article or research paper they had, but just a thought that pops into mind, and just like dump down as many ideas. And then go back and just like, okay, get rid of the ones that don't make any sense or are answered somewhere else. And then the idea is just to combine that down into a few key bullet points. And importantly, I try not to structure them necessarily as questions, because I don't want to fall into reading directly a question verbatim. I want to be reminded of a certain topic, but still be within the conversation to ask something that naturally comes up. So that's what the process generally looks like. But it starts with just lots of reading or watching or listening, and trying to find what are a few things that were particularly interesting within that maybe within that article or that paper or that interview they didn't necessarily get into in an avenue that I was thinking about. And that's what it kind of looks like, but it's not super systematic, but that's the way I tend to approach it.
Got it. I have a sort of an arbitrary rule for myself that I start prepping for a podcast. I do my best to make it 4 to 5 days before, just because I find that I might spend the same amount of time prepping for a specific podcast, but the amount of days prior gives me more room for potential questions to pop up if I'm out on a walk or in the shower, whatever it is. And if I don't allow myself that time, I tend to miss certain things and then after be like, shit, I should have asked that. Is that something that you do as far as timing goes for pods, or is it completely random?
I do think there is something to that, because what I have found is my preference now is to do that research and prep in advance, but not to do it on the day or at least immediately before the actual podcast recording. And so I can do it whether that's one day before or multiple days before, and have it done, like you say, split over maybe a couple of bouts of doing that. And once I have all those kind of crystal bullet points in my head, having that done ahead of time, and then not going and doing intensive research just before that episode, and just having a quick scan through of those points and then letting that conversation happen. Whether that is necessary or whether it's just a placebo, I've just found that tends to work pretty well. And maybe it's just because I just have maybe more mental resources left, or maybe it's just questions then pop into my mind that aren't programmed by that author's script or the way they write something. It's just something that emerges. But I tend to like doing that now. So I think there may be a parallel to what you do with that.
Got it. So what makes a really good question in your eyes? So for example, do you think there's a specific recipe or structure to asking a question in a way that yields a better or a worse response? Or how do you think about that?
That's a really good question. I think there's general classes that have a different spectrum between them, and each one can influence the quality of the question. By that I mean from one end of a spectrum being really generic or general, and the other being very, very specific. Going towards the end of more specificity usually is always better in most cases. Not all. I don't think there's any one set rule. So I think there's some very general questions that work well. So, for example, the last question of my podcast all the time is, what one thing can you do each day that people can improve their lives in any way? That's a big, broad, generic question. And that kind of breaks apart from the rest of the podcast, which I think actually works pretty well and allows people to go in any direction. But when it comes to the nutrition and the science question, I find a very targeted, specific question works well. It allows that person to dive into an answer pretty immediately, and they don't have to think about, okay, what background knowledge do I have to build the listener up to before I can actually answer the question? So for example, if I said to you, hey, Marcus, I've got someone that wants to just try and get fit and healthy. What sort of exercise should they start doing? Right? It's so generic that you can't answer that question. You would have to take a step back and say, hold on, here's a few other questions we would have to answer first, or here's a better question. So it's too generic to be useful. And so the more specificity, I think, the better. One thing I also try and do is, if possible, is there a question that they may not have heard before, or at least phrased or framed in a certain way? This has the advantage of it allowing the podcast episode to be a bit different from others, but I think it's also stimulating for the guest. And the more I put a lot of attention of how can I keep this conversation as interesting and stimulating for the guest, because that's when they tend to do their best work. Their answers tend to be better. And my only goal of the podcast is to help a guest get the best quality answers out they can. And one way I can facilitate that is through a stimulating conversation. And the way I do that is keep those questions interesting or something that they haven't really heard over and over again. So there are some things I keep in mind. So that's from a questioning perspective. And then usually I will try and at some points throughout that interview process have either a follow-up clarification or restating their answer in a certain way that keeps the listener up to speed. But in terms of what makes a good question, I would say that specificity, intrigue, and maybe some degree of novelty works well.
I love that specificity concept. Now, I want to share what I think actually makes you a good podcaster and why I wanted to have you on specifically for this episode. So I don't know if you remember this, but years and years ago, before I even started my podcast, I emailed you to say thank you for putting together Sigma Nutrition Radio, because I was getting so much value from the info that you were putting out. And I mentioned that I thought that you did a great job as an interviewer, because I remember I said this specifically, you get out of the way. So you quote unquote, get out of the way. Now, what does that mean? It's like, you don't actually talk that much when you're interviewing someone. For the most part, you let your questions, really good questions, display your knowledge and thought process on a specific topic. And I do think there's a serious art to that. So my question is that something that you developed or put in place consciously, or is it just your natural inclination to ask questions in a way that display your knowledge versus just stating your opinion? I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. And I think it's a paradox that my exact intention is not to try and demonstrate my knowledge. And I think that's the problem that some hosts fall into, of the ones that, like I've heard people report it, and I'm sure we've both heard certain hosts on podcasts across all domains where the host either talks way too much, interrupts their guest constantly, answers their question after asking it. I've heard that several times, where someone is trying to frame a question, answers it, and then says to the guest, "So what do you think?" And it's like, oh, okay, I agree, I guess.
You said it.
And then some people would find that a bit arrogant, but I think it's just counterproductive. It's a way the host is trying to demonstrate what they know. And so I think paradoxically, like, people are pretty smart. They can see through that. And I know that my job as the host of the podcast is, like I said in the last answer, to get the best quality information out of this guest to the listener. And so my only role is how do I facilitate that as best as possible. And so if my answers seem to demonstrate a degree of knowledge, it's not because I'm trying to sound smart. It's because the way I think you ask the best question, as we've discussed, is do lots of research and preparation. So that means you're going to be talking in terms that are very specific. You're going to be using correct language. You're going to be able to talk at a level that your guest is familiar with. You're going to be asking interesting questions. You're going to seem like you've been prepared and well read. So if all those things give people the impression that I know my stuff, what it really is saying to them, that this guy is prepared. And so that's not because I'm trying to show them how much research I read in preparation. It's because just by doing that, that's how I'm going to get the best answer from this person. So I think that's the kind of paradox, that the way you demonstrate that you understand something is by not trying to show your listeners how smart you are and all the stuff you know. Because all the time in podcasts, particularly in the first couple of questions, to get to the real interesting questions that you want to find out the answer to, you have to get all the listeners on the same page first, to a certain baseline level of knowledge on a certain topic. So usually the first couple of questions of an interview are going to be things you probably know the answer to. Now, rather than jump in and try and let all your audience know that you already know the answer, your job is to, can you get the guest to explain a certain concept to them, define a certain term so we all understand, and then we can get into the interesting stuff. So again, the goal is not to show everyone that you know this stuff already. It should be really just to facilitate a good answer. So it's conscious how I go about that, but it's not. I'm not consciously trying to show how smart I am. I'm trying to do the opposite, if that makes sense.
That totally makes sense, man. Now, regardless of content, who are some of the best podcasters out there right now, in your opinion?
I think this depends on the podcast format and the type of vibe they're going for. So regardless of what people think of him on certain topics, like Joe Rogan is just a phenomenal podcaster for the type of podcast he does. It's hard to think of someone who's just a generally better conversationalist that talks across different topics to different people and can get everyone to have a conversation. Like, I'm pretty sure I was talking to a friend that I'm not sure, so people have to check it, but it was relatively close to each other. I think it might have been the same week, but I could be completely wrong, where he did an episode with Bernie Sanders, and then not too long in around that time, he did one with Wiz Khalifa, right? And I listened to both of those, right? And I was like, that takes a special human to be able to do that. That they were both good conversations that I enjoyed, and he was able to talk to the people. And if people are unaware, Bernie Sanders and Wiz Khalifa are not very similar, I would say. And so Rogan is an amazing conversationalist, but if that's not the type of format someone's going for, you don't want to try and mimic Rogan, right? So you look at what other people might do in the podcast space. You go to the other end where you have really highly produced podcasts. So whether that's some of the Gimlet podcasts or NPR or This American Life, where you have these massive production teams all in studio, massive amounts of editing, journalists going out into the field. They have a completely different vibe from what we're doing, and they have different resources. They're also really well constructed, but it's not the same as a true interview kind of format as we would be doing, which might be more similar to someone like a Tim Ferriss, for example, or Shane Parrish has something called a Knowledge Project, or I think Sean Carroll does a good job on his Mindscape, I think is his. There's lots of people with that. I'm going to prep properly. I'm going to ask interesting questions. I'm going to try and pull good information from people. And the common characteristic, again, is interesting questions driven by asking the right questions. So there are some people that I look to. There's probably loads that I'm forgetting, but there are a few that I think are at the top of the charts for certain reasons, you know?
Yeah, Joe, I mean, he has to have the most experience because he's got well over 1,000 episodes and they're like 3+ hours. I mean, the sheer volume and the sheer hours that he's put in is astounding.
Yes. Yeah, it's crazy. And it's a very unique thing, though, what he's doing. So I can acknowledge that he is an amazing podcaster for that reason, but he wouldn't be one of the ones that would try and model anything on, because it's just a completely different type of interview that I'd be trying to do. Like, there's often times where he literally goes in and just like starts talking to someone, and that's the value of his podcast. You know, if he's doing 3-hour podcasts 3 times a week with all these various different people, there's only a certain amount of time he can prep. And even beyond that, I think the value of his is coming at it from this just whatever questions pop to mind. He's almost on a similar level to as we'd be going into that conversation with this person, asking genuine questions, which is a different vibe to what the MMI podcast and what your podcast would be. So it's trying to find which interviewers do certain things that are set up in a similar vein, or even just people who ask interesting questions. For example, I remember I was watching, I think it was a video or an interview, the kind of popular philosopher Alain de Botton was talking about how people can ask interesting questions when they're, I think it was like dating or coming across new people and they want to connect with someone more deeply. And he kind of started listing these interesting questions. And so I went to my phone. I was like, I got to write these down. Like, I don't think they're ones I might be asking at a podcast, but the type of thinking of how many layers deep that question goes, and the way they were constructed. So it might be something like he was saying, asking someone when was the last time that they cried, or something like that. There's a specific reason behind it, and it's just different, and it's novel, and it's interesting. So I'm not going to ask that on my podcast, but that's where the idea of, it's kind of a novel enough type of question, or just phrased in a certain way that kind of jars you enough to say, this is kind of interesting. That can I start doing some of that? Trying to take it from different areas, I guess.
When was the last time you cried? Just casual first date talk.
Right. Yeah. I probably shouldn't reveal to them, every night into my pillow.
Right.
It's typical exactly. For me. Yeah.
Now, I know some folks go back and listen to old podcast episodes and essentially study themselves, looking for ways that they can improve going forward. Do you study yourself as an interviewer in some way or another?
Not particularly. What I do is probably more informal, that I do take serious feedback that people give, and try and find, is there commonalities that commonly occur, particularly when I think that it's sincere advice. So there's people that I've been lucky enough that have been on my podcast that have became good friends, and in very serious settings have had a word to give some compliments and feedback about some of the things within the podcast. And I try and, for me, the natural resistance is just to kind of brush off, it's nothing much. But I do try and think about, what are they actually finding that is good? Like, what is the specific thing that was useful, or why did they think it was a nice interview? And I also will do a reflection, but mainly on a podcast that I think went quite badly or exceptionally well. I'm not so good at doing it probably in the largest part of the bell curve in the middle. And I think maybe that's natural for people, but just I think that's the way you upgrade over time. And that's just what experience teaches you. You do things, and when you make a mistake, you try and see how you can correct it. If there's things that work particularly well, you can see, was that an accident, or can that be done more readily? So for me, it's been more informal. I probably could systematize a reflective practice around it, but I just haven't done so. So yeah, it's probably been more informal of how it's hopefully improved from the start to now.
I'd be curious to know what drives you to think, is it right after a podcast where you're like, man, that went really well, or that didn't go so well? Or is it often that you listen back in the editing process and you're like, ooh, that went better than I thought, or worse than I thought? Or what sort of leaves you with the feeling of that was a successful podcast versus not so much?
That's actually a really interesting point, because oftentimes if it's at any of those extremes, I get that immediate feeling once the call is done, like that was amazing, or God, I think I did a bad job there. Like I didn't get out of that what I was hoping to. I've had both of those feelings, but I've also learned that they're not always accurate. That sometimes I felt, God, I just think I did really badly there. Put out that podcast and people were like, I really love this episode. So really? So like take a bit of a listen. Oh, it actually sounded not so bad. Like I must have just been all in my head. But then there's sometimes, the kind of clarification if I'm doing editing, and I'll hear, if I knew I didn't really get much out of the podcast, I'll take special attention to, well, what were the way I asked those questions? Is there a better way I could have framed that question? Is there something I forgot to ask that was more important? And then the one that often gets me is noticing something interesting that person said, and I didn't follow up on it properly, because that's something I really try and put a lot of premium on, that I hopefully try and do relatively well. And I think in general, maybe one of the strengths of my podcast, I try and listen out for things that are interesting to follow up on it, which is again the other advantage of not sticking to like this super tight script. But if I have missed something obvious, it's like, it's not so much, I don't get too harsh on myself. It's like, a missed opportunity for something good there. So there is an immediate feeling, but I found it's not always accurate. So yeah, kind of the editing process reveals a bit more. But then even beyond that, you just actually don't know until it goes out. And that kind of goes back to our very start of our conversation when we said this, being able to try things, getting immediate but real feedback is important. Not planning a podcast and seeing if it would be good, like doing it and having it out. And the feedback that matters is how are people responding to it. And that will be the key. And once I can see that, then I can be a better judge of how it went.
Yeah, I've had that exact same experience, looking back and thinking that something went really poorly and it didn't, or vice versa. Right. So the sort of hindsight gives you a little bit more perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. Because I think it's if you get that feeling during a conversation, like, this is not really going in the direction I want, then that almost consumes your mind for the rest of the conversation, which could have gone really, really well. And I've definitely had that where I listened back, I was like, oh, that was actually really good. And at the end of the call, it's like, I messed that up, but I didn't, so that's kind of nice if that happens.
So true. Now, have you thought about interviewing people from different realms other than health and fitness specifically, or do you see yourself staying solely in the health and fitness space?
Yeah, I've thought about that a lot, and it's something that I would love to do. It would definitely be as a separate podcast, but the time hasn't came yet to do so. For the reason I just know there are certain projects I need to get done, I need to focus on, and a degree of there's still things that need to be done better with the Sigma Nutrition podcast. And but yeah, it's always been this thing I've thought about. It's like I just like interviewing people, and there's people I could have good conversations with. So it's there in my mind, and when that happens, I don't know. But I have thought about it as the answer, and I think for anyone who starts to enjoy interviewing, I guess it's probably a natural thought to jump to. because, hey, guess what? We're all humans with lots of different interests beyond this one thing that the internet knows us for, right? So, I've had that thought, as I'm sure you probably have had it at some point too.
I have, yeah. I have branched out a little bit and interviewed people that I've just been interested in, and it's been really fun because, like you said, we have all sorts of different interests, and at the same time, you can only talk about protein, carbs, and fat so much until it gets to a point where you're like, all right, there's a little more to life than, macronutrients.
Right. Yeah. And I think within mine, I've probably push the bounds of what could still be relevant within mine. So mine is called Sigma Nutrition, but many of those episodes aren't nutrition, right? Some are directly related, like they're a health science or maybe sleep. Then I go a bit further, and some are around like sports psychology. Some have got into touching around like anxiety. Some have got into like social isolation. So all things related to health science, but I'm kind of pushing the bounds of what is still within the nutrition health science sphere. I've done one with Barbara Oakley on learning, for example, and best strategies to learn. So it's still relevant to my audience, but it's not technically nutritional science. But yeah, my thought has been like, I'll just go do a completely different one where I can talk to friends who are like musicians and creatives and just people who've done like random mad things in their life. Like that would be kind of cool, where there's literally no bounds to anyone. That'd be pretty awesome.
Especially after watching maybe an episode of Rogan's podcast too, because you're like, God, that looks so fun and interesting, and he's just going wherever the fuck he wants to go.
Exactly, yeah. And I think it would keep it so... like you can get into a really deep, detailed, nerdy conversation, and like then to recover from that for your next episode, go and talk to Wiz Khalifa or someone.
100%, man. Now, before we get to where folks can find more of your work, is there anything that we didn't get to today that you'd like to leave the listeners with?
No, I actually think we covered most of the really important points that anytime I'm asked about this from friends or whoever, that are the things I really try and hammer home to people, if they're either considering podcasting, they're already podcasting or interested in it. Again, it's about realizing if it's a good match, if it's a good fit for you, if you actually like doing it, and then be able to put your resources towards it. And then because I've also got the question of how to grow a podcast, and how do I like grow it and get more listeners. And I'm also kind of glad that wasn't a question, in the sense that some people ask it purely for only focus on numbers, instead of, I loved your line of questioning of how do I create a good podcast? How do I ask good questions? How do I make this the best thing I can? Because they're the exact things I tell people they're the questions you should be asking. And then whatever the number is ends up being the number. You can't tell yourself in 3 months I'm going to have X number of downloads. You don't have control over that. And it doesn't matter all the marketing or ads or whatever someone wants to try and do. If you're not having good conversations, it's just not going to work. So that is the point I would say to people, that there's a degree of patience involved. And then the only solution for that is you need to enjoy doing a podcast. Otherwise you won't keep with that patience. And then it needs to be the craft of how do I get better at doing this thing. I think because the barrier is so low to get into podcasting now, people think, I'll just start a podcast. I'll ask these people who are big in the industry, and then everyone who follows them will follow me. Does not work like that. And as I'm sure you can attest, the number of followers a guest has, at least to me, has had zero correlation with the number of downloads the episode gets or how much people like it. Like zero correlation. So thinking that I'll just get these people on and they'll do all the hard work, it's like, no, you'll get them on and have a really bad conversation if you try and do that, and no one will care. So it's exactly what you said. It's a craft, how you try and do better and ask interesting questions and get the best from that person that you can, and that you enjoy it, and then just keep doing that, and there you go.
Yeah, man, I totally agree on the how to grow a podcast front, because it's sort of like asking how to make a viral video. It's like you just can't control how the public is going to respond to whatever information. You can make it the best you can, but there are things that are out of your control.
Right, exactly. Totally agree.
So where can folks find you, Sigma, social handles, all that good stuff?
Best place is probably just sigmanutrition.com, SIGMA, sigmanutrition.com. On if they're looking for the podcast, it's a Sigma Nutrition Radio on any podcast app. And then on social media, they can get me on Instagram, Danny Lennon _Sigma. And then on Twitter, Nutrition Danny. Any of those places, I'm happy to hear feedback or take questions or just come say hi.
Awesome, man. I will link to all that stuff in the show notes. And thanks for taking the time. That was awesome.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure. Thank you so much for doing that.
I hope you guys enjoyed that interview as much as I did. Now, if you're interested in personalized one-on-one nutritional coaching and or workout design with me, you can head on over to n1fitness.com/coaching or just click the link in the show notes below. Feel free to follow me up on Instagram at N1Fitness and friend me at Marcus Sadu on Facebook as well. Thanks for listening, guys, and I will catch you on the next one. See ya.